Hi, my friends. Welcome back to CTO Demon channel. 2 weeks ago, I went to the MLCTO meeting in Nice, south of France, organized by the MLCTO Academy. What a wonderful meeting it is. I didn't realize that Nice has such a holiday vibe and such a beautiful coastline. And next to it, of course, a fantastic course with 12 incredible live cases and incredible content and teaching. A shout out to Alexander Fran, Stefan, and to Canvas, and thank you guys for inviting me. I had a wonderful time there and learned so much. They had a very interesting way of doing things. They randomized operators to work together. So two great CTO interventions work together on the same case. And the session that I chaired, they supposedly randomized, Yamani Sensei with Bill Lombardi. I was stressed out about that, you know. This is the East versus the West battle that is now peaking between the two East and West operators doing a case. Fortunately, they did a marvelous job, wonderful case, and they were friendly, they didn't fight. So I had an easy job. I also got the chance to present the Global CTO Safety paper, and for the first time to meet so many of my co-authors, because this paper and the work of the Global CTO algorithm all started during COVID. So I've never seen many of these co-authors that I work with. They were all introduced to me through Canvas and through Manos. So it's so nice to meet them all and to actually see the faces that contributed to my learning and to greet them was fantastic. And I learned so many little things that I'm dying to try out. Carlino talked about the safer technique, type of anti-grade fenestration technique, which I'm dying to try out now. I need a suitable case, of course. But one, I think, thing that I want to pick out from the meeting particularly is a concept about the CTO PCI risks. And I think this was very well illustrated by two cases. One was Canvas's live case, and another was a case that Manos presented to us. So in Canvas's live case, it's a very calcified RCA CTO. The distal cap is right at the bifurcation of the PL and the PD. Now, following the global algorithm, of course, if you have a distal cap bifurcation, you should go retrograde. The concept behind this is that you want to safeguard both PL and PD branch. Now, there was a very nice, easy septal collateral, and the Canvas made a comment that this is a zero risk collateral because in his hands, this very good septal collateral adds minimal, I won't say zero, but minimal risk to the procedure. Of course, people corrected him and said, well, no, every pit of a retrograde has its own risk, and it's certainly not zero risk. It may be low risk, but it has risk. At that point, I stopped them and said, well, no. Although the retrograde crossing itself and using the retrograde has risk, okay, but it's actually overall negative risk. Because if we didn't go retrograde and we carried on antigrade, there would be substantial risk of losing either the PL or the PD. A wire may not puncture true to true right in the tip of the carina. It might puncture into the PL or into the PD, and if we stent, we're going to lose the other branch after periprocedural MI. The risk of that is quite substantial and certainly much higher than the risk of Canvas crossing that septal channel. So, although doing the retrograde through that septal channel has a small risk, but because by doing the retrograde, you remove the risk of losing the PL and PD through antigrade, which is that big, overall, you have a negative risk by going retrograde. So I introduced this concept of negative risk options in a CTO procedure. Unfortunately, while I was saying all this, Canvas is already getting into the retrograde CTO body lesion, and his retrograde wire got stuck. And then everybody pronounced that this is very high risk now. The retrograde has increased the risk tremendously. I agreed at that point that we're an incredibly high risk, and perhaps retrograde has increased the risk. But over the last week or so, I've been thinking about the case, and I've come to a slightly different conclusion. You see, the calcium in that CTO is what contributes to risk. Whether Canvas goes antigrade or retrograde, the wire was going to get stuck in the calcium because this is the beast we are working with. The beast of this CTO is that whatever wire we put into it is going to get stuck. And the wire that got stuck got uncoiled, and it probably got uncoiled with antigrade too. And although, yes, you could argue that a retrograde uncoiled wire is higher risk than an antigrade uncoiled wire, actually, the risks are pretty similar. You have an uncoiled wire there. It's not huge risk, but it's pretty similar, really. Whether you uncoil down into the channel or you uncoil up in the aorta is still an uncoiled wire. It's the same sort of risk. But of course, the retrograde still removed the distal cap risk. So going retrograde by itself is still negative risk. The risk from the patient comes from the patient anatomy. The patient himself is high risk. It is not that particular technique that's high risk. So we need to separate out the risk of the patient, the risk of the anatomy, against the risk of each procedural step. So another interesting case that Manos showed was this, again, an RCA CTO, very calcified. And he got the wire across, but because of the severe calcium, he couldn't manipulate the retrograde wire into the antegrade guiding. So he snared the wire and pulled it in, at which point the wire kinked against all the calcium and could not be moved, and he got a stuck gear situation. Now, one would argue, oh, retrograde is very dangerous here, retrograde is very high risk, or snaring is very high risk. But again, it's not the snaring that's high risk. We snare wires all the time and we don't get into this problem. It is the calcium in the CTO body that's the high risk, and the calcium causes the kink and causes the gear to be stuck. Of course, there's a slight difference here. Snaring the wire and pulling on it probably does kink it more than if you didn't snare the wire. So if we snared it and we kinked it, probably snaring would be positive risk. It would increase the risk of stuck gear. But if you think about it, the alternative of snaring it is to drill the retrograde microcatheter harder to try to cross that calcium and then switch a wire to wire the guiding. Drilling the retrograde microcatheter can also get it stuck. In fact, in the APCTO Club CTO registry, we have 5 such cases of retrograde microcatheter getting stuck inside calcium. So that also is not a perfect solution. But the retrograde microcatheter getting stuck or the wire getting stuck by getting kinked is all due to the inherent risk in the anatomy of that patient. And each step we make may make this inherent risk worse or better. Snaring might be worse because you will kink the wire more. Drilling the microcatheter too hard will be worse, but trying to drill it may not be. Passing a retrograde small balloon might be better, might reduce the risk, might be a negative risk step. So we need to learn to separate out the risk of the procedure against the risk of each different individual step. Now, things get far more complicated than this. I'm going to give you an imaginary scenario, and part of the CTO Demon video is that on video I find it easier to use our imagination. And imagination is our friend. Imagination is a great way to learn things. So come with me on this imaginary journey. Let's imagine there's an RCA CTO and the distal cap is at the bifurcation. And the distal cap is one of these terrible distal caps where it's quite a sharp, big angle between the LAD and between the PDA and the PLV. Almost 180 degrees PLV PDA angle. Now you know these. Those of you who've done some retrograde know this. If you come through a septal, very often what happens is that the septal is not at a good angle towards the distal cap, and the wire will keep slipping down the PLV. Let's imagine that the PLV is quite big, long PLV, and it's got significant diffuse disease in the proximal segment. So that if you poke a wire down into the distal cap and it comes off the distal cap, the sharp wire is likely to dissect into this diffuse disease and you risk losing the PLV. So it's a distal cap bifurcation. So going retrograde improves the chance of saving both the PLV and the PDA. And so going retrograde via the septal is a negative risk step. We take that and we go through the septal. Now, we start with maybe a UB3 or a Gladius EX to poke the distal cap. And we can't get in, and this wire is deflecting into the PL. And as it deflects down the PL, we realize that the wire is maybe scratching the lesion in the PL, and we begin to realize that there's a risk of losing the PL. Okay, so the next step we should do. So there are several options. Let's say there's an avial groove channel that connects to the PL, and we could wire down the PL, and usually in these cases, the PL is a much better straight shot at the CTO distal cap. It's a good angle attack. And so if we go down the PL, not only will the wire track through the PL lesion and keeping the PL safe, it can actually have a good angle attack. An alternative might be we could dilate the channel up and put a Suzuki double lumen catheter down to onto a PL wire and use a second wire to puncture the distal cap. This, of course, will give us less chance of deflecting down the PL and also poke in. Now, let's say we balance the risk. We feel that the risk of going through an AV groove channel, which is higher than a septal channel, of course, we know that already, is higher than using a dual lumen catheter. Assume we make this decision. So we go down with the dual lumen catheter. And if everything is smooth, we go down and we use the Gladius or the UV3 and we poke, and still the same thing is happening. The wire is deflecting down the PL. Okay? And there's now risk. Now we have to balance two different sets of risks. Do we continue using this wire, which has a risk of damaging the PL, or we switch to a high penetration force wire, which of course is less likely to deflect to the PL, but if it does, okay, of course, it's a higher penetration force wire. But now, of course, there's also a risk that you might penetrate the distal cap and go outside the vessel architecture. Okay? So, or we can go back to the AV groove. Of course, that's still possible. So let's say the operator decides that among these three options, continuing the same wire, there's high chance of losing the PL. So he's not going to continue to do that. He's going to step up to a high penetration force wire, determining that going through the AV groove channel is still higher risk than poking with a high penetration force wire. He tries one or two pokes at the distal cap, and the high penetration force wire goes clearly outside the vessel anatomy. Okay? Because the angle of the dual lumen catheter makes it impossible to poke it into the vessel architecture. Now, at this point, the operator has learned something new, that using this system is actually not lower risk than going through the AV groove. Because now he's used this system, he knows that a low penetration force wire is going to damage the PL, a high penetration force wire is going to be in the wrong direction. It's not coaxial enough to penetrate the cap. So he takes out the dual lumen catheter, replace it with the microcatheter, and then he crosses the AV groove channel. With the AV groove channel now, he can attack the distal cap and he can penetrate. But you realize at every point in the procedure, the operator has to think and reassess the risk of each step. And if the high penetration force wire on the dual lumen through the septal worked, then he wouldn't need to think about AV groove. If he went to the AV groove and he found that it was very difficult and he couldn't pass the O3 wire, and the wire was getting into strange places, and he tried a knuckle XTI, he couldn't get through, he tried a Sion black, he couldn't get through, then you have to reassess. That channel obviously is more tortuous than he thinks and is higher risk. Then he might have to go back to the dual lumen, or he might have to go back to antegrade. So the operator needs to, at any one time, be constantly thinking about what is the next step, and what is the risk of the next step, and how is this risk contributing to the total risk of the procedure? Is it a total negative risk step or a total positive risk step? And I think I would say this was one most interesting piece of thinking that I've taken away from the MLCTO course. And I think this kind of thinking helps us when we're doing CTO to know what steps to take. It's this constant risk assessment based on our previous experience. The previous time we tried this, had it work? Didn't it work? What was the anatomy? All constantly analyzing the anatomy and matching up from our experience database the risk of each step and comparing the steps that allows us to choose the best step for the next part of the algorithm. Now, of course, you can write a nice algorithm and line up all the steps, but this kind of detailed risk assessment cannot be written down in black and white. And so I thought it's a nice chance to explain it on a video for all of us to learn. Of course, Nice was a beautiful place. I enjoyed the place very much. And just before I left, I enjoyed a nice stroll along the peppy beach. Actually, the stroll was a little bit hard on the feet. It's quite rocky. But I took a picture for all you guys. And I hope I get invited back to Nice and I may see some of you there. next year at MLCTO. Bye bye.